Good evening. Thank you all for coming to the final round of our Oxford debate competition for the 2023 Regents Cup. I'm Henry Olson. I'm be moderating tonight's finals. This is an opportunity to engage in an Oxford-style debate on a topic related to liberty, prosperity, and the Constitution. The prompt the students will be discussing today is: pursuit of liberty should take precedence over pursuit of prosperity. I'm going to explain to you the phases of an Oxford-style debate, and then I'm going to introduce our student teams and the judges. There are 3 rounds in this style of debate. In the first round, you will hear opening statements presented by one student from each team, the affirmative team and the negative team. In the second round, teams will engage in cross-examinations of one another. During this time as moderator, I have the prerogative to ask some clarifying questions if necessary. Judges, during this round, you can raise your hand if you have a question for the students, and as time permits, I may call on you towards the end of the cross-examination so you can pose that to the team that you wish to question. In the final round, one member from each team will present closing statements. At the conclusion of the debate, our judges who have received training on how to score an Oxford-style debate will complete their scores of the event. They will then be posted on the tournament events results page of the Regents Cup webpage, azregents.edu/Regents Cup 2023. Probably more importantly, the winners will be announced in the presentation award ceremony, which will shortly follow the conclusion of this debate. Now allow me to introduce the student teams. On Zoom, joining us from Northern Arizona University is the affirmative team, Hunter Larson and Sage Kaminsky. Here in the room, joining us are the negative team, Drew Dalmia and Zenobia Chevalier-Mossman of Arizona State University. And now I'd like to introduce our judges. Larry Penley, Treasurer, Regents Cup 2023 Tournament Advisor and member of Arizona Board of Regents. Michael Polyakov, President of the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. G. Murray Snow, Chief Judge of the U.S. District Court, the District of Arizona. Paul Luna, President and CEO of the Helios Education Foundation. And Molly Green, Senior Director of Policy and Strategy of the Salt River Project. Thank you, judges, for coming and being part of this finals today. Remember that you should be as objective and unbiased as you can as you listen and score the round. Your score should reflect who made a better argument, not your personal positions with respect to whatever arguments or positions they have taken during the debate. Students, before we begin, please note that our timekeeper, raise your hand. There we go. We'll hold up a 1-minute sign when each round is about to wrap up. I will then announce the end of the round. So with no further ado, I would like to start the opening statements with the affirmative team of Northern Arizona University.
All right, I will be starting my time now, and I just wanted to say congratulations to my opponents. This is obviously really exciting. Thank you guys so much for being here. Thank you, judges, and thank you to my partner. Me and my partner affirm today's resolution that the pursuit of liberty should take precedence over pursuit of prosperity. This should be weighed upon utilitarianism because we wish to provide the most amount of benefits to the most amount of people. Before I really get into my speech, though, I would like to pose a question for everyone in the room to think about throughout this round. That question is, can one truly succeed in their endeavors if they do not have the freedom to try? We define pursuit as employ measures to obtain, liberty as the state of being free within society from oppressive restrictions imposed by authority on one's way of life, behavior, or political views, oppressive as burdensome or very cruel or unfair, precedence as the condition of being considered more important than someone or something else, priority and importance, order of reign. Prosperity is the condition of being successful and thriving, especially economic well-being. And for our background, we just wanted to restate that there are 3 inalienable rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This leads me to my first contention. You cannot have prosperity without liberty. Prosperity cannot survive without economic liberty. Economic liberty is the right to earn a living in the occupation of your chance without unnecessary government interference. The key ingredients of economic freedom are personal choice, voluntary exchange, freedom to compete in markets, and the protection of person and property. Economic liberty implies personal liberty as a precedent. Without economic liberty, there cannot be prosperity. Economic liberty is a crucial precondition for sustained, vigorous economic growth, which leads us into our second contention. Only free people can truly be prosperous. People that are not free are unable to become economically prosperous. Take Russia, for instance, a state run by an authoritarian regime. The majority of Russian citizens are extremely impoverished because they do not have the ability to attempt to make their economic dreams a reality. According to the Heritage Foundation, if there's one thing the American experiment proves, it's the power of freedom to transform lives. If you let people control their own destinies, there's no limit to what they can achieve. But if you blind them with straitjacket central planning, smother their creativity with overregulation, fence them in with high tariffs, and take their hard-earned money with high taxes, you kill their dreams even as you wreck an economy. That's the central lesson of the 2008 Index of Economic Freedom, just released by the Heritage Foundation and the Wall Street Journal. A country-by-country survey of how free people are worldwide to direct their own economic fortunes, the index repeatedly demonstrates the vital link between freedom and prosperity. Simply put, the freer people are, the more an economy grows, and the more everyone benefits. Take something as basic as income. In the world's most restrictive economies, rated as repressed or mostly unfree by the index editors, average income hovers around $4,000 a year. But in a moderately free economy, it's 3 times as much, $12,830. If you're in a mostly free one, you can double even that amount, $26,630 annually. And in a free economy, $33,579, more than 8 times the money you'd earn in an unfree economy. Turns out you can put a price on economic liberty. For an example, we have child stars. As we saw with Britney Spears in the conservatorship, it gave her father all the money. She had no right to her money. She had no right to buy anything. With Macaulay Culkin as well, the child star from Home Alone. He sued his parents for emancipation which came out to $17 million as per People magazine when he was 16 in 1997. His parents' control over his money led him to sleeping on his own couch because his parents mismanaged his money that he earned. To get prosperity, you have to have the freedom to spend your own money. The Atlantic Council quantifies the inaugural Freedom and Prosperity Indexes, which the Atlantic Council's new Freedom and Prosperity Center unveiled this summer, in which synthesized volumes of data about nearly every country show that democracies do indeed deliver. They revealed the most effective ways for governments to invest in their most important resource, their people. Our data, which draws from and builds on the invaluable work of several other country indexes, suggests that the best path to prosperity is the same across the world, through political, economic, and legal freedoms. Citizens in countries ranked as free are 13 times as wealthy as those in unfree countries, according to our indexes. And that's not the only way they're prospering. They're also happier, they're healthier, and they're part of more inclusive societies, all in tangible ways that we can measure. So, the alternative, prosperity before liberty, does not and it cannot exist. Finally, according to the Milken Institute, which further proves that prosperity before liberty does not exist, states, consider the alternative of living in constant fear that the money I earn today will be worthless tomorrow. In a recent op-ed about Venezuela, Carlos Hernandez described the terrible reality of living in a collapsed economy and a collapsing dictatorship. In an environment where the purchasing power of his local currency degrades by about 3.5% per day, keeping his wealth in bolivars, is financial suicide. He shares a heart-wrenching story of going out to buy milk, and upon finding none, how he had to buy something, anything, before his money lost value. When you cannot even buy milk with your money before it becomes worthless, how can you possibly consider saving for a more prosperous future? And with that, Me and my opponent are going to keep proving that pursuit of liberty should take precedence over the pursuit of prosperity because there's no verse, there's no alternative. Pursuit of liberty does take precedence. I'm sorry. Pursuit of liberty does take precedence over pursuit of prosperity.
Thank you. And now we'll hear opening statements from a member of the Native team.
Mic check. Mic check. Before I begin, I'd like to extend a few thank yous as well. I want to start with all of the members of the audience and the judges for being here. Thank you for your time. We really appreciate it, and we couldn't do this without you. I also want to thank our competitors for showing up today. I know NAU was stuck in a snowstorm, and we really appreciate the fact that you guys are still here on Zoom, even though you guys are going through this. But I also want to thank my teammates. In the pre-round, in the round before that, and the pre-round before that, our teammates were just constantly helping us. And we couldn't have done this without you either. Thank you. But finally, I want to thank my partners in Ovia. No way we could have done this without you. Thank you so much. But with that, I guess I'll start my time up here. All right. Indian philosopher and economist Amartya Sen observed, economic growth without investment in human development is unsustainable and unethical. The balance of society is like a scientific scale. On one end of the scale weighs liberty, the freedom to live one's life. On the other end weighs prosperity, the means to engage in society. Should one end of the scale tip uneven, then the balance fails. And either liberty overcomes prosperity or prosperity quelches liberty. To clarify today's debate, we offer the following definitions. Liberty in this case represents the natural right of individuals. The 14th Amendment understands natural rights to include life, liberty, and property, whose liberty includes the freedom of speech, of the press and association, the freedom of religion, the right to keep and bear arms, legal rights against unlawful search and seizure, legal representation and due process, and finally the right to vote. Prosperity, on the other hand, implies human development. The UN Human Development Index measures prosperity against 3 dimensions. First, a long and healthy life. Second, knowledge. And third, a decent standard of living. The indicators of each dimension are life expectancy at birth, expected years of schooling, and the mean years of schooling, as well as GDP per capita. Nations who prioritize and meet the UN Human Development Index are prosperous. We must clarify that the negative position does not mean the abolition of liberty, nor does the negative require any sort of reduction of the liberties held by citizens. Instead, we maintain that prosperity is as important as liberty at the very least. Liberty without prosperity is an empty promise, and prosperity without liberty is dangerous. A truly fruitful society holds each in balance to ensure human development so that individuals can live freely in a society. Because individual development is a critical component to the broader development of society, we negate the resolution, the pursuit of liberty should take precedence over the pursuit of property. Our first substantive argument is that securing the basic necessities of life allows individuals to exercise their freedom. What humans value in life is not only freedom, but rather the ability to express oneself. Maslow's hierarchy of needs ranks the rudimentary necessities of life. At the very base of Maslow's hierarchy lies physiological needs: air, water, food, shelter, sleep, and clothing. Above physiological needs are safety needs: security, employment, resources, health, and property. To achieve higher forms of human development, such as love and belonging, esteem and self-actualization, individuals must first secure the basic necessities. Without them, individual life can lack meaning. While it is not the role of the government to prescribe meaning to individuals' life, the government should promote these basic necessities as much as possible. Sen furthers that development is a process of expanding the real freedoms that people enjoy. Freedom, in itself, does just mean the negative liberties of the affirmative. Freedom depends on other determinants, such as social and economic arrangements. For example, facilities for education and healthcare, as well as political and civil rights. For example, the liberty to participate in public discussion and scrutiny. Economic development, particularly GDP, is the main predictor of human freedom, socially, economically, and politically, which we see in both our evidence and our opponents. The theory of modernization posits that economic growth is the main catalyst of democratization. As development drives the standard of living, educated and secure citizens begin to demand democratic reforms from the government. Without prosperity, people have the time and resources to assemble, without which people remain under the burdens of unfreedom, abject poverty, and tyranny. In some cases, the lack of freedom correlates directly with the lack of public utilities. Which brings us to our next contention. Advances in liberty have been made through prosperity. Studies conducted by the Wall Street Journal and the Heritage Foundation demonstrate a causal link between liberty and prosperity. They found that wealthier nations, by the metric of GDP per capita, also ranked higher on key freedom indexes. The reason for this is clear to see. Prosperity and liberty, rather than being prioritized over one another, walk hand in hand in a free democratic society. Strong institutions allow individuals to achieve success, and protecting property rights, which then affords citizens greater freedoms and independence. We see the same reflected in our nation's founding. In an article for the World Economic Forum, two distinguished economists from Harvard and University of California disclosed their research findings. British America, what became the United States, had attained world leadership in living standards long before the founding fathers built their new republic. America actually led Britain and all of Western Europe in purchasing power per capita during colonial times. Britain's American colonies were already ahead by 38% in 1700 and 52% in 1774, just before the Revolution. In short, prosperity came before liberty, so prosperity is the prerequisite to liberty. We see this in the greatest experiment in liberty in history of the world, and we see this reflected in contemporary examples, and see this as the reason why we are proud to negate this resolution. Finally, prosperity has led to some of the greatest innovations in our society. To substantiate this argument, we ask you to look to antiquity, beginning with ancient Greece. The widely known big three philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, all hailed from Athens, the most prosperous and influential of the Greek city-states during its golden age. And Plato was only able to transcribe the works of Socrates because the Greeks were successfully able to defend themselves against the threat posed by the Persian Empire. But now, I want to make a quick observation. The affirmative in today's debate has to prove to you that liberty must come before prosperity. Given the wording of the resolution, even if you don't buy the negative team's argument that prosperity comes before liberty, all we have to prove to win this debate is that we should, at the very least, pursue both liberty and prosperity simultaneously, hand in hand. Judges, members of the audience, we ask you to negate today's debate because prosperity is the soil in which the flower of liberty blooms. Thank you.
Thank you. We are now done with our opening statements and we move to the cross-examination. Affirmative team, do you have a point from your own statement you would like to augment or a question that you would like to pose regarding the negative position?
Okay, so my question is, you guys are arguing that prosperity and liberty are equal, right? That is the main gist of your argument.
My apologies, technical difficulties. Could you repeat that?
The main gist of your argument is that prosperity and liberty are equal and we should not prefer one over the other.
Well, they are equally important, but prosperity is presuppositional to liberty.
Okay, but can you give me, so if I ask the question of, were slaves in the Americas allowed to become prosperous before they became free?
Well, that was part of a significantly larger system that was inherently and systemically racist. It was the slavery of other individuals. We are currently operating under the understanding that everybody in the society is currently free. That was a very hyper-specific case, but also one could look to the fact that slaves were not paid enough in the Americas to be able to become free. There are cases of slaves being able to buy their way out of slavery. That was an actual reality. So even in that instance, prosperity is still presuppositional to liberty.
So, just a real quick follow-up. When you say that we're taking on the mindset that everyone is free, are you stating that universally we are now taking on the mindset that everyone in every single country is free?
No, we're taking up the mindset that it is incredibly important for prosperity to come before liberty. I would pose the argument and the question, in fact, to the affirmative is there a country where liberty in fact came first, where there was no economic development or growth, and that liberty simply bloomed instantaneously from that?
I think we can talk about plenty of different examples. We can talk about how in the Middle East, Western European countries, some countries were really big colonizers of the Middle East. Countries in the Middle East fought off the Western European powers, their colonizers, because, well, first off, nobody in these countries was prosperous. Nobody was making large amounts of money except maybe like the top 1% of oligarchs who were working with these governments. But because they fought for their liberty, they were able to achieve the ability to become prosperous. We look at Saudi Arabia as a very large wealth. People in Saudi Arabia are very wealthy, however, they used to not. It's probably the best way to put that.
How did these countries fight for their liberty?
I mean, most of them fought through military means, which is kind of the main one.
My apologies. I have to respond to the comment about India and the Middle East. In relation to British colonization, that was primary in economic development. The reason for British colonization primarily has to do with gaining financial benefit. So for you to say that it is in no way related is simply blatantly untrue.
So if you're saying that if we look at India specifically, because obviously that was a very large part of colonization for Great Britain, the British people became extremely prosperous by taking away the liberty and the freedom of the Indian people. The Indian people were very poor, were suffering because of this. They had to fight for their liberty to have any chance of becoming prosperous because they weren't majority power.
Well, one could argue that they took away those means first. I mean, the tea trade, for instance, was a vast overtaking from the British Empire. I mean, one cannot necessarily look at this argument without also seeing that there are means involved of taking over liberty from the Indian people had to do with their resources.
But then how did the Indian people become prosperous throughout this entire thing? They can take away the prosperity of England, but they didn't become prosperous before they gained their freedom.
The negative team's argument is that by taking away prosperity of England, they were able to become prosperous themselves, and that's the only thing that allowed them to become free.
Okay, but then our argument to counter that is by taking away the prosperity of England, they were able to now, obviously England wasn't going to have any say in their country, they gained liberty, hence they gained prosperity. It went prosperity, take away prosperity, liberty, gain prosperity.
Right. You're forgetting one thing though. The reason they were able to take away the prosperity is because they were prosperous enough to be able to muster the forces, take away, as she said, with the tea trade. They were able to take away England's prosperity because they were prosperous. As a result, they were able to use that in order to gain their liberty back from England.
Okay, but what was prosperous with them gaining these forces? How did they gain these forces? Did people get paid to fight against England, or were people simply fighting against England because they wanted to be free?
Well, it's very clear that you can clearly weaponize prosperity. It's not something that's a unique argument. Ultimately, they did take away the means for these individuals to be free, but once again, if you look at the root cause, it comes back to prosperity instead of liberty. If somebody is economically prosperous, it's a lot harder to take away their liberty, and we would argue impossible to do so. But if you take away somebody's prosperity, or ability to make money, or ability to obtain some amount of prosperity, then they are inherently going to be drawn to not having liberty. So we would
Okay, go ahead, finish up your point.
Of course, thank you. We would argue that ultimately they took away their prosperity first, which is what allowed them to take away their liberty.
Okay, so kind of flip away from India. You make the statement that once somebody is economically prosperous, it is nearly impossible, it is pretty much impossible to take away their liberty. So what happens if you were, was I misunderstood in how I understood that?
Yeah, it's not impossible. I mean, Britain's prosperity, I guess, was hampered by when colonists rose up against them. But I mean, I can hear the rest of your question if you want.
Yeah. So I will then ask the question of, say we're here in the United States, for example, or anywhere in pretty much any country. If you throw somebody in prison because they committed a crime, they no longer have access to their finances. They no longer have the ability to increase their prosperity because they don't have freedom. Once they are released from prison, then they have the ability, once they have their freedom, they have the ability to continue gaining prosperity.
They gave up their prosperity when they went to prison and therefore had no freedom. That's the way we rule.
But they choose to just give up their prosperity. They
Well,
had
by
it
committing a crime, yes, we would argue that's exactly what happened.
But would you not agree that the government took away their prosperity, not the individual themselves, and take away the prosperity from themselves?
No, because they breached a social contract. The reason why we have laws in the first place is so that we are able to uphold the moral contracts and ultimately the physical contracts that we have and that we obtain. So in reality, the difficulty overall with saying that they take away liberty first is to ignore the fact that that social contract was initially broken. Also, to this point, within the court system, there is the operations of bail as well for less heinous crimes. So one could also argue that prosperity still outweighs liberty at this point.
So what if we're talking about like wrongful convictions, which we see all the time in the US? People didn't choose to commit a crime, yet they had their freedom taken away, they lost their assets, they lost their prosperity, and they have to wait till they're free again to continue having their prosperity and continuing to grow their prosperity.
Yeah, I think the error in that understanding comes from one of the first words you said, which was the wrongful conviction. We can't look at the wrongful conviction as the right way to, I guess, analyze what happens between liberty and prosperity. That's not the way we want our country to run. So that's not the way that we're going to analyze how liberty and prosperity interact with each other. And if I could add to that, if there's anything that the last 5 minutes have proved with the back and forth about liberty and prosperity, it's that liberty and prosperity go hand in hand and are necessary for each other, but not that liberty comes before prosperity, which is the argument of the negative team.
So, just a final question. Do you guys, it's a yes or no question, do you guys agree or disagree that you have to have the freedom to spend your own money to be prosperous? And again, in our case, we gave the example of child stars who did not have the freedom to spend their own money. Would you still consider them prosperous?
So that, I feel like, almost answers the question. You're talking about the presupposition that you have the money to spend. So in the instance you give, and ultimately you would like to move this to governmental bodies rather than individual, but for the sake of the argument, you could move it to individuals. They already had money to spend, and then liberty was restricted from that point. In all the cases that you bring up, prosperity was still present.
Okay, we'll just flip the question to you, so give you guys your time.
All right, yeah, you bring up a lot of examples about colonialism, but given the resolution today, presumably with the United States not being colonial right now, how would you say that, I guess this whole argument about attaining prosperity through liberty stands?
So, okay, before I answer that, can I ask a clarifying question?
Sure.
Are you only talking about the United States? Because you talked about how the Fourth Amendment talks about the specifics of the United States. Because this resolution says nothing specifying we're talking about the USFG, people of the US, anything like that.
I mean, for the purposes of this question, yes, but honestly, it's your choice.
Okay, so if we're not, so can you restate the question one more time?
Okay, so my question is, given these like colonial examples, I guess moving away from that, how would a country that is not, I guess, like a colony, how would a country, an actual country with a government, how would the government prioritize liberty in order to achieve prosperity? What would that look like, and how would they do it?
So, I mean, that's kind of basically the entire idea that the United States was built on, right? We have the ability to have economic freedom. We can do all these things because we have liberty. We can become rich. We can have all these billionaires and everything because we have liberty. We can achieve the American dream and become prosperous because we have liberty. If we look at a country like Russia, they don't have that liberty. They don't have that freedom to do what they want because they live in an authoritarian government.
So, okay, so for this argument, is the understanding that liberty is, can you give an example where liberty came first before prosperity? That is ultimately kind of the overarching question that I have, because what I understand is, for instance, in Russia, there's an oligarchy system, or there are systems where a lot of individuals run the systems of power and the means of prosperity, which then impacts liberty. So I'm a little bit confused as to how you come to liberty first over prosperity. So if you could explain that, that would be very helpful.
Go ahead, Mr.
Okay.
No,
I mean, again, this is just going to bring me back to the point that I made earlier about slavery. We saw this large group of people here within the United States that needed to become free until they were able to own their own property, really make money, because not all slaves made money, even though, yes, some were able to buy themselves out of slavery. They needed to be free. They needed to have the Emancipation Proclamation. They needed to gain that liberty to have any chance of becoming prosperous and not be property.
Again, and you guys define prosperity as including knowledge and life, and one could argue there was no trace of prosperity in enslaved people in the United States until they got liberty. Then they started gaining prosperity.
I think here it's important to echo what my partner was saying a couple of questions ago, where she said that the reason, well, I guess actually before I say that, the civil rights movement is what caused the freedom of these slaves, right? So what happened is the civil rights movement started with awareness. It started with slaves that were able to get away from their situation, become prosperous in order to achieve that liberty, and then raise awareness in the entire United States about what was going on. It started with so that liberty that they achieved for all slaves across the country to no longer be slaves, that liberty was because of the prosperity of a few key individuals in our history that were able to prosper, that were able to develop as humans, as our definition says, that were able to have the knowledge and a decent standard of living at one point in their lives to be able to get that.
Also, real quick to add on to that, if that is acceptable to my opponents and the judges. The difficulty there is you had the abolition first, correct? And then ultimately moving on to the civil rights movement, one of the largest pillars of the civil rights movement was about developing economic freedom for Black and African American individuals. That is still a pillar of freedom. It is presuppositional because one cannot be free without initially having that ability to stand by oneself. Prosperity is ultimately that baseline that we build liberty off of.
Okay, so I mean, my response to that comes down to the fact that we fought a war over slavery. The United States obviously fought its civil war over slavery because we believe that these enslaved individuals had the right to be free. If the Confederacy had won that war, they would not have gained the right to be free. There needed to be this great confrontation to even get the ball rolling of the civil rights movement. We needed to give this enslaved population their freedom, and then we were able to allow them to attempt to become prosperous. Obviously, it took much longer than it should have. However, again, they didn't even have the ability before they were free. They wouldn't have had the ability had the Confederacy won the war.
So I would make the argument there that the Confederacy in this instance wanted to keep slaves because of economic prosperity. Having unpaid labor significantly increases your ability to make revenue and make production. This is a well-known fact. So ultimately, it was a fight over not necessarily liberty initially, but prosperity in total. And of course, once again, we would like to reaffirm the fact that the Civil War happened significantly late, especially considering America's founding. However, we must again look at the fact that this was a war fought on prosperity, not necessarily liberty.
Yeah, but then my big counter to that is the white people of the South, of the American South back during the Civil War, had become prosperous enough through fighting in the revolution, through the fact that the United States was its own country, to be able to fight this war to take away the liberty of another group. Just because one group gains prosperity doesn't mean that every other group should lose it and lose their liberty.
So, can I talk to you guys like?
I'm sorry?
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead, and then I want to give the judges an opportunity.
Thank you very much. So firstly, I would like to point out the fact that slavery, the horrific institution, was based off of still taking away prosperity. Slaves were not living on their own farms and their own houses. This is presuppositional to taking away liberty. This is the ultimate issue. If we observe the fact that slaves were absolutely unable to care for themselves in their own homes with their own families, we can then look at the fact that their liberty was taken away. It is it is impossible to have somebody be completely economically, individually free and have then take away their liberty. This is simply just not feasible within the context of the plan, and maybe you could help clarify that point for me.
Do judges have any questions as we move into the last 10 minutes of the cross-examination period? Yes?
Would both sides discuss some of the current practices in a number of nations, including our own, namely such institutions as rent control and government ownership of property and resources in the context of this question of liberty and prosperity?
Wait, could you clarify the last one, please?
Yeah, in the context of the priority of liberty or prosperity, please discuss such institutions as rent control and government ownership of property and resources.
Right. Really quickly, before you begin answering, can somebody tell us what the question was? We can't hear it. Throw her our mic.
Okay, so to the best of my understanding, the question was that if, when discussing liberty and prosperity, can you sort of provide, like, or talk about how the government owns, like, rent control and, like, owns property and rent control? That's
Yeah,
awesome. Sorry if I missed
getting back to the question as framed, the priority of one.
Give me the mic.
Oh,
Prosperity. Okay, the issue here is how he says it. Fairness? No, that's not your fault. We're trying, this is a new.
Apologies for being so awkward in communications here, but in the context of different countries, especially our own, could you discuss such institutions as rent control and government ownership of property and resources in this question over which should have precedence, either prosperity or liberty? Yes?
Was that question for the affirmative or the negation, or just open-ended?
It's for everybody.
Thank you, Mark.
That was a question for all.
All right, I'll give you guys the chance to speak first.
Thank you very much, I appreciate that. So ultimately, the way that we can frame, the way that we can look at this argument is the fact that individuals in rent-controlled housing do not have the ability to obtain prosperity for themselves yet. This allows the government to come in and essentially establish a certain baseline of prosperity for those individuals. So it's not taking away liberty or in any context. It is simply allowing for those individuals to establish prosperity on their own, so they are truly able to move outside of a governmental controlled context and become free, truly, not under any kind of understanding that is based off of government.
Does the affirmative wish to answer that question in some way?
Yeah, so I mean, I have a pretty short answer here that I think just kind of summarizes everything. Even those people who live in rent-controlled housing, they're still American citizens. They still have liberty, they still have freedom. As Americans, they have the ability to become prosperous and pursue their own prosperity through whatever means they see necessary, so long as they're not going to commit some sort of crime, like they're not going to rob a bank, obviously. And by having rent-controlled housing, we are not doing anything that is either taking away their liberty or their ability for prosperity. They already have that. That's all that I really have to say to that.
Does the judges have any more questions?
Okay,
Let's
I'll
go.
make it quick, I promise. So responding to that, actually, I think that when the government intervenes sort of in these people's lives when they don't necessarily have that prosperity yet that they can, prosper on their own, I think that's in the best way possible. It's a limiting of their freedom. So you're limiting their freedom because they don't have the prosperity to be fully and infinitely free. But when we prosper to the point where we can be free, that is when, you rely less on the government for things like welfare or rent control, things like that. And that is when we can become, fully free. And we don't see that in the United States, obviously, because I guess, to each, like, prosperity or liberty, you never take that to the infinite level. But the concept sort of still applies.
Give him the mic.
Is there anybody else you wish to ask a question?
Sure.
You've all discussed liberty and prosperity almost purely in economic terms. Is there any value to liberty that isn't tied to prosperity? And is there any value to prosperity that isn't tied to liberty that should be considered in this question? And are we so based in Western thought that we aren't actually considering how other cultures might approach this question?
Is that a question for both sides?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. Who wants to take that first?
I can answer first if you guys are okay with that. So I think the big point there is that we're so ingrained in what Western culture believes to be prosperous, what Western culture believes to be liberty. If we look at Eastern cultures, countries in Africa, the Middle East, etc., we see these different. None of us in this room, our Zoom room, have the same idea of what it means to be prosperous. None of us have the same idea of what it means to be have liberty. We have a more uniform idea because we are a Western culture than we would with somebody who lives, say, in Afghanistan. However, again, if people have the ability to decide and and attempt to do things that is going to lead them to be prosperous in their own eyes, that's what we are arguing. That one needs to be free enough to make their own decisions to become prosperous to whatever extent they believe is correct and whatever extent they believe to need to simply exist. Just because we are, as a Western culture, have a kind of more set idea of what we believe to be prosperous, doesn't mean that the idea changes. If you are not free to choose, you are not free to become prosperous.
Thank you so much for that question. I really appreciate it. So I would say that liberty is a lofty ideal. It's the ideal that we hold as Americans, that we create a country that is free, that allows liberty for all individuals. However, it's not quantifiable. And so I think this is where liberty and prosperity, for me and for our team, diverge quite a decent bit. So prosperity is quantifiable. One can look at the income of an individual, differences between income of various groups, but you can't necessarily do the same thing with liberty. The reason why we say that prosperity is presuppositional to liberty is the fact that prosperity ultimately is a good basis. It's a grounding understanding of what we are attempting to find out about our country as a whole. It is a metric, ultimately, is how we see it. And then liberty, based off of that, allows for us to understand better how we can create equality as an ideal rather than an individual.
I'm going to add 1 minute onto the final minute because of the problems of communication with respect to the judge's questions. So we have 2 minutes left from this point onward, which you can use to cross-examine one another. And then could you please, timekeeper, put up the full symbol to signify when those 2 minutes are up.
So if I can briefly add to what my partner was saying, I think that another answer to your question lies in that this is where we think that prosperity and liberty also go hand in hand. Prosperity without liberty, liberty without prosperity. We brought this up in the first speech that we don't think either one. We think one is dangerous, and we think that liberty without prosperity is an empty promise. And therefore, we need to view them hand in hand. And that's how I think countries prosper. They view them as equally important. They pursue like prosperity, and gain Middle East as a result, but both of them were candidate at the end of the day.
Okay, so my final question is, what would you say if there was a country in the world and there was somebody who had $100,000, just to throw a random number out there. However, they had no real freedom or ability to choose what they were spending that money on. They had no ability to increase that money, to do anything to actually show that they're prosperous. $100,000, I think we could all agree, you're doing pretty well for yourself. But if you don't have the freedom to use it, what's the point?
Well, one could argue that having money but not being able to use it, which is the form of social currency that we currently use, is not prosperity in reality. So because that individual, I'll take in the hypothetical, that individual not being able to use their $100,000 for any means is a restriction of prosperity and therefore liberty.
Okay, I don't know how much time we have left, but you have questions? Any questions left for you guys?
How much time do we have left?
15 seconds.
15 seconds.
I guess I have one final question. Do you think, to flip it onto you, do you think that having the freedom to spend money but not having any money at all is, I guess, is that a better world?
Go ahead.
I'd rather have the ability to spend $1 than have $100,000 and not be able to spend it.
We also are arguing that by having liberty, you have the ability to become prosperous. Just because you don't have any money does not mean you don't have liberty or that you're not going to become prosperous. We are arguing, again, that it should proceed over the pursuit of prosperity.
Thank you.
All right.
I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. The cross-examination period is now over. We will now move to closing statements. Each side has 5 minutes. One person from each team will deliver their statement. We again begin with the affirmative.
Okay, if everybody can hear me and there are no objections from anybody, I will start my 5 minutes now. So yeah, I just want to reiterate the point. Thank you to everybody for being here. Obviously, there's supposedly an audience. I can't see you guys, but thank you for being here. Thank you to my moderator for being here. Thank you to my opposition. Congratulations on making it to the semifinals. And thank you to my partner, Sage, who stepped in a week ago when one of my original partner actually dropped the competition. The value of liberty is something that we as the affirmation wish to ensure that no one in this room is able to undervalue. We also agree that it is important for people to become prosperous. However, I reiterate the point that liberty has been shown to come before prosperity. Without freedom to pursue one's goals and desires, no one will ever succeed in them. We've seen countless examples where individuals and even groups of people were not able to obtain any sort of wealth, any sort of prosperity, because they were not even given the simple right, they were not given the freedom to try. Take my slavery example, for instance. People of color within the United States, the majority of people of color within the United States, had no rights. They had no ability to own property, they had no access to education, and frankly, their ability to live. What type of life is it when you are owned by somebody else? They needed to be free to become prosperous. And the definition of prosperity for them was simply to have that freedom. They needed to become free. They didn't care how, they didn't care what they had. They just wanted to be free. We can also look at Vladimir Putin in Russia. Vladimir Putin himself is worth $70 billion, while millions of his people are on the brink of starvation. The people of Russia live in this government, live in this state, this authoritarian regime, where the top 1% of Russians are free to become as wealthy as they want, because the rest, the other 99% of Russian citizens, have no freedom at all. They have no ability to really expand their own businesses or invest their money to obtain more money. There is not any freedom for them to become economically prosperous, which really is the key. Money is the key to anything today. Economic prosperity for the individual is important, and we want to have the most people possible becoming prosperous. People have fought for centuries to be freed from any sort of tyranny. Millions of under-equipped and underprepared Algerians fought to shake off the shackles of the French, who had colonized them for over 100 years. These Algerians were fighting with weapons that were 50 years older than those of the French military. That is not good odds for the Algerian people. However, they did not become prosperous. If they were prosperous, their weaponry would have been the same as the French. The French become prosperous by taking away their freedom. However, they did not care. They did not need to become prosperous to want to fight for their liberty. They wanted to fight for their liberty to simply have a chance at becoming prosperous. People have fought for wealth in the past, yes, but only those who are elite and actually free within their state benefit in a financial sense. The everyday citizen, the soldier, the just normal serf of the world gets nothing out of this. That is why they fight for their liberty, so they actually have a chance to become prosperous, so they actually have the chance at a piece of the pie. Again, the pursuit of liberty should and does take precedence over prosperity. My opponents argue that that prosperity and liberty are the same. We should not value one over the other. However, this simply perpetuates nothing. We see no change when people believe that prosperity and liberty are the same thing. We do see change when people believe that their liberty and the ability that they would have by obtaining liberty to become prosperous creates change. It creates democracies. It creates a world that is better for the majority of people, not the 1% of Russian oligarchs who are billionaires. Individuals need to be truly free to prosper. I go back to my point that I made. I would rather be able to spend $1 than have $100,000 and not be able to spend on anything I want. We can talk about the hierarchy of needs. These countries that live in places, these people that live in countries where liberty doesn't exist, they don't have the right to safety. They don't have the right to anything because their government, if we look at Russia again, the Russian government is able to come to somebody's door, pull them outside their house, and send them to Ukraine to go die in a war they don't believe in. They do not have freedom. They do not have liberty. And if you're dead, you're not going to become prosperous either. Everything that the negation says that is a benefit of prosperity only adds strength to the affirmation case, because liberty comes before prosperity. My partner and I strongly affirm the resolution. Pursuit of liberty should take precedence over the pursuit of prosperity, because we believe that one cannot truly be prosperous if they do not have liberty. I believe that the true importance of liberty was accurately summed up by Patrick Henry on March 23rd, 1777, when he said, "Give me liberty or give me death." Thank you.
Thank you. Now we'll hear the closing statement from the native.
Thank you very much. Before I begin my time, I would first like to extend some thank yous. Firstly, thank you so much to the audience for engaging today with civil discourse and this larger understanding to make America better as a whole. I am deeply grateful for your participation. Thank you to all of our judges for taking today to judge us effectively on what metrics we are doing well by and which we are slightly too correct as time goes on. Finally, I would like to thank my coaches, Dr. Jenny Bryan, Mary Joseph, and Dr. Adam Simons for helping me with these cases. I'm incredibly indebted to them and could not do this without them. Finally, I would like to thank my debate partner, as none of this would have been possible without him putting together the cases and allowing to and presenting them in such a well-presented way. Thank you. I will start my time now. Firstly, I would like to come back to the prosperity meaning of this debate. It is impossible to take away an individual's liberty without first taking away their prosperity. Prosperity, as we have noted multiple times through this debate, is presuppositional to liberty. Prosperity allows for us to go on to achieve education, to go on to achieve our goals and dreams under the American system. It is simply impossible to say that one with only $1 in their pocket is truly at liberty to do whatever they want. No one can buy a college education with $1. No one can run for office on $1. It is simply impossible to go about this argument without first acknowledging that prosperity is the baseline out of which we function. The purpose of this debate, and ultimately a net ballot, combines these two. We are representing that not only is liberty important, liberty is the ideal. Liberty is what we hold as our highest goal as Americans. Liberty is a far-reaching dream that we all strive for. Prosperity is the action. Prosperity is what allows us to reach for liberty. Prosperity is ultimately what we strive for in action while our eyes look higher to the sky of liberty. This is the difficulty with assuming that liberty comes first. If liberty is an ideal, and you restrict an ideal, one could say that if you have unlimited prosperity, you could search for other ideals within that context. However, if you take away somebody's prosperity or somebody's ability to achieve prosperity, you are taking away their later liberty. An individual with no money, with no resources, with no economic leg to stand on, does not have any liberty in truth. I would like to bring up two of the points made by my competitors, the two of which being slavery and India as case studies within this larger context. Firstly, we must look at slavery of African Americans within this country in the context of prosperity. These individuals were clumped together to live together in areas that were owned by their owners, which is horrifying. However, once again coming back to the argument, they were not prosperous, so they could not be free. We do have examples of individuals who had been enslaved buying themselves into freedom. It simply does not work if this is flipped. Lastly, we have to question what is liberty and what is prosperity. Coming back to our understanding of what liberty is. Liberty, within the context of this debate, has been fundamental to each of the arguments that my fellow competitors and that my fellow teammates have made. Every argument comes back to this understanding of liberty, to this one goal, to this one ideal we hold to be true. Liberty is what connects us as Americans. Liberty is what holds us together through strife and through times of struggle. Liberty is ultimately our connecting factor. Prosperity is not. Prosperity is presuppositional. Prosperity is quantifiable. Prosperity is something we ultimately strive for, but liberty is something that we can only reach for. Liberty is the highest goal that we obtain as Americans, as individuals, as people in the community. It is what ultimately connects us as individuals to our country. We have been given this great honor to be here today, to understand these principles. So, we must reaffirm that ultimately, prosperity, as in the cases of slavery in India, as brought up by my competitors, was controlled before liberty. Liberty cannot be controlled without control of prosperity. I thank you for your time here today, for your time here, and for the reminder that what connects us all together is our pursuit of liberty. I thank you, and I yield.